Thank you, ma'am. A very warm welcome to today's webinar on comparative world literatures, hosted by Hindi University West Bengal. This webinar is a part of our ongoing efforts to foster intellectual dialogue and explore the unifying power of literature across the world. Through this webinar, we've aimed to understand how literature acts as a bridge across cultures. This session will be chaired by our Honorable Vice Chancellor of Hindi University, Professor Nandini Sahu ma'am. And today, we are honored to have a renowned literator, Professor Kumar sir, and established English creative writer, Dr. Nishi Pulugurtha ma'am, as our distinguished speaker. Now, it is my honor to welcome Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Nandini Sahu ma'am, who is also a former director of School of Foreign Languages, IGNOU, New Delhi. She is an established Indian English poet, folklorist, and a renowned creative writer. Not only that, she is one of the Amazon's best-selling author, and she's the author and editor of 21 books already. Apart from being a double gold medalist during her graduation and post-graduation, she is also the recipient of the Literary Award, the Gold Medal, from the Honorable Vice President of India for her contribution to English studies. She is the recipient of the prestigious Michael Madhusudan Academy Award 2024 and Lifetime Achievement Award 2024 as well. As a professor of English, her areas of research interest cover Hindu studies, critical theory, new literatures, Indian knowledge systems, comparative literature, children literature, folklore and studies, and American literature as well. Now, I would like to welcome Professor Nandini Sahu ma'am for the opening speech. Professor Nandini Sahu ma'am.
Thank you, Paramita. I must congratulate you for taking this initiative and doing this important webinar, being the convener of this. I warmly welcome Professor Kumar and Dr. Nishi Pulugurtha. Both of them are my friends, very good friends. I would like to give some remarks about both of them before you formally introduce them to the participants. Professor Kumar is a senior professor and also the former director of Department of English in Delhi University. He is a name in the country when it comes to literary theory and Dalit literature and cultural studies, kind of very important and pertinent subjects. When I was new in Delhi in the year 2006, he was one of those people who made me feel at home in Delhi and then introduced me to the Delhi academic circle. Professor Rajkumar is a very dear friend. He is like an elder brother to me, and he is an established scholar, and he has been the examiner of many of my research scholars for their PhD, and he has been very, very kind. Apart from being a good scholar, he is an extremely kind and a genuine person, a person true to the trade, true to his profession, and also a true human being, a real human being. So, sir, I welcome you to this important lecture series of Hindi University. I hope that your discourses, your discussions are going to be very beneficial for our faculty and students. We are planning to introduce a new department of comparative world literatures. Your lecture will be used as a part of that new department, as you know, as a part of that syllabus design committee, as a part of the new department, and everywhere we will be using your expertise, your support, and the lecture that you are going to deliver. And about Dr. Nishi Pulugurtha, I know her since I think more than a decade now through social media. I met her on Facebook. Then I got to know the wonderful work she has been doing. She is very popular among her students. And there is this Poetry Society, IPPL, I believe. She has introduced that. She will talk about it. And she has united all the poets from West Bengal, especially from Calcutta, and then she conducts many programs through that platform. Recently, she had invited me to a Sahitya Academy program where I saw how seamlessly she has been conducting her programs, and she is academically very sound. She is an excellent poet and a very warm human being. It is my pleasure to meet her in West Bengal. When I joined West Bengal, this Hindi University as the Vice Chancellor, she was the first one who sent me a message that welcome to West Bengal. We are going to meet. And then within no time, we met in the Sahitya Academy program, and today we are meeting for the second time. Dr. Nishi, we value your support and your cooperation with us. I welcome you very warmly to this lecture series. I hope that your lecture is going to be extremely beneficial for our students. Now, Dr. Paramita is going to introduce and welcome both of you formally. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Now, it is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Kumar sir, who is currently in Department of English of Delhi University. His research areas include autobiographical studies, Dalit literature, Indian writing in English, Oriya literature, and post-colonial studies. He has been a fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla in 1999 and has published in journals such as Social Action, Satirtha Bulletin, The Fourth World, Creative Forum, Language Forum, Jadavpur Journal of Comparative Literature, Indian Literature, Social Scientist, Journal of the School of Language, Literature and Cultural Studies, International Journal of Communication, Ramadevi Women University Journal of Social Sciences and Humanities, International Journal of Religious Tourism and Pilgrimage, Ravenshaw Journal of Literary and Cultural Studies, Economic and Political Weekly, Studies in Humanities and Social Sciences, Journal of Comparative Literature and Aesthetics, and Sociological Bulletins. Professor Rajkumar sir has also translated literary texts from Indian languages, especially from Oriya to English. His book, Dalit Personal Narratives, Reading Caste, Nation, and Identity, has been published by Orient Black Swan, New Delhi in 2010. Yes, and it got reprinted multiple times. His English translation of Akhila Nayak's Veda, the first Oriya Dalit novel, has been published by Orient Black Swan in 2019 and it has got reprinted multiple times as well. His other publications are Bama, Writer as Activist, which has co-edited with S. Armstrong and was published by Routledge in London and New York in this year. And along with this, Padapodi Beyond the Point of Return, which is a translation of Vasudev Sunani's Oriya novel Padapodi, to be published by Orient Black Swan from Delhi this year in 2025. Now, I would request Professor Rajkumar sir for his enlightening lecture. Professor Rajkumar sir.
Yeah, thank you, Paramita. So, first of all, that I really want to thank Professor Nandini Sahu and for our remarkable, maybe, that feat to become Vice Chancellor, Honorary Vice Chancellor, no? Nandini. So, that for the invitation and the kind word that she has already, that introduced to the audience at the beginning. So thank you so much, Professor Nandini. I also want to thank Dr. Paramita, who is coordinating the event, and that it is my pleasure also to meet Dr. Nishi Pulugurtha. Though we are meeting for the first time, maybe we'll keep that continue to meet maybe. So and of course, that I'm really extremely happy to be with you. I'm sure that we'll have a lot of interaction because I have a small paper to read out because I wanted to be concise in my approach to the topic, that which is already announced, comparative world literatures. And I think that at the end of the maybe lecture we'll have interaction as much as that possible, so that I will also that try to learn from maybe that the august audience. Now the topic that I'm given maybe half an hour, maybe I'll try to finish it so that I'll be able to, fully do justice to the topic that I'm trying to cover up. This is quite a broad and very general, the topic, and that's why I have to throw my net far and wide to catch and collect some pressing issues relating to world literatures, and that too in a comparative perspective. So, that what I will try to do, I will raise some of the question at the beginning, which involves three words. One is, that what exactly is world literature? So maybe, that I'll try to go back to the very idea of world literature and its historical emergence. The second is because comparative perspective is what, that we are trying to hint at while studying world literature. I'll also try to bring what is called comparative literature, but again in a comparative perspective. And then translation, which happens to be an inevitable part of both world literature and comparative literature. I'll also raise some questions around the act of translation. So at the beginning, let me clearly tell you that these are some of the pertinent questions that we have to ask while addressing the topic like comparative world literatures. What is world literature? No, these are basic things that we need to understand because we have to be clear about what we are talking about. How is it different from universal literature or global literature? Which are the common parameters for comparison, if at all there are comparisons? What role does translation play in the formation of world literatures? What are the pedagogical challenges? Because all of us, we are either students or teachers, and we have to deal with text. So when we are talking about the pedagogical approaches, what are the parameters in which we have to, that face challenges? So these are some of the questions I will try to address throughout my lecture. But before I begin to answer this question, which I have raised already, let me give you a little background to the historical emergence of world literature. So let's deal with the idea of history. As commonly known, the term world literature, which is in German called Weltliteratur. I'm not very good at German, so maybe that world literature. Weltliteratur. No, that is what that in German. And this is credited to the German writer. I'm sure that everyone knows about Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who in 1827 has written thus, and I quote him: I am convinced that a world literature in a process of formation, that the nations are in favor of it, and for this reason make friendly overture. The German can and should be most active in this respect. He has a fine part to play in this great mutual approach. Unquote. So in a letter to Carlyle, Goethe in 1928, 1 year after he started writing about what is world literature, then he writes to Carlyle in 1828, and I quote, that one maybe small passage from his letter. You will greatly oblige me by informing me on this point, for it is just this connection between the original and the translation that expresses most clearly the relationship of nation to nation, and that one must above all know if one wishes to encourage a common world literature transcending national limits. So the emphasis here, whether there is possibility of a common world literature by transcending national limits, unquote. Between 1827 and 1832, the year of his death, Goethe passed away in 1832. Goethe has supposedly used the term world literature not less than 21 times. So, that this is what, that the research is. He conceptualized the term in the aftermath of the French Revolution of 1789 and the Napoleonic Wars with the hope that Germany would play a major role in Europe for restoring peace and tranquility after, that the havoc that uh, Napoleonic Wars created all over maybe, that Europe. In such a context, he advocated that the German language and German literature could serve as meditators. I use the word meditators deliberately for the dissemination of work in foreign languages throughout Europe. Goethe thought that in the process, a transnational literature would come into being that would serve the cause of understanding and toleration among nations and peoples. So that was the whole purpose of trying to find out a new way of that literature to be used for maybe that restoring normalcy and maybe that giving some kind of responsibilities to a writer to raise questions. 200 years have already been passed ever since Goethe had used the term world literature. And the world had changed a lot with post-coloniality and globalization, among others. I just, that point out only two important consideration, particularly in the world of the nation. So one is post-coloniality, which is a very big, maybe, that event throughout the world, and globalization, of course, among others. Further bringing several changes in the theorization of history, culture, language, literature, among others. So I'm not going to deal with, that what happens to say the idea of language when it is post-colonial time, or what happens to say, that idea of literature or history or culture when it is, that particularly, that when onset of globalization. Maybe if there are questions, I'll be happy to answer, but I'm just leaving certain ideas as it is. So when we think about particularly think today about writing of histories of world literature, it is no more confined to Europe alone. In a post-colonized, globalized world, both the world and literature are to be redefined. As Fritz Strict in his essay titled World Literature and Comparative Literary History writes, and I quote Strict, there is not even a consensus as to what we should understand by world and literature, world within quote and literature within quote. If one talks about the world, one usually thinks primarily only of Europe, and world literature stands for European literature. Of course, in all scholarly endeavors, it is indispensable and apt to limit oneself. Who can really completely and in detail master even one single literature? But Europe is not the world. And the question should precisely be asked whether world literature doesn't really begin where the borders of Europe are being transcended. After all, and regardless of the diversity of its peoples and literature, Europe remains a self-enclosed and relatively homogeneous cultural community. Here we are reminded of the book like Imagine Community by, that the Benedict Anderson, where he talks about, that when we imagine about Europe or write about its history, culture, and people, one language, one religion, and one territory. So that is what precisely, that self-enclosed, particularly homogeneous group. Whereas, say, in the case of India or many countries of Africa and other parts, that there are multiculturalism, diversity, and plurality so much so that we cannot think about the idea of homogeneity. So we have to think about, that how homogeneous cultural community Europe is and the international relations between its literature only concern this particular community. One has to go beyond this Eurocentric perspective in order to gain the right to dare speak of world literature. So it is only through world literature that we can try to understand about not just Europe, but also its borders and that other people. That is what the idea of that this quotation is. True to Strick's observation cited above, the world literatures gain momentum with the coming of comparative literature. And this is what my second part is. So one is the idea of tracing the history of world literature. The second is coming of comparative literature and how both world literature and comparative literature try to that help each other, grounding a that reality whereby we can always try to understand about multiplicity of that literary genre, not just that in Europe but throughout the world, and that's where the justification of world literature. So, true to strict observation cited above, the world literatures gain momentum with the coming of comparative literature as an autonomous and independent discipline. Though the term comparative literature was first used, I'm sure that people know it, but I just wanted to remind you. So that's where I have done little research on. Every time I think about that giving a new term, I have also tried to understand about the history and its maybe that influences that we had worldwide. So though the term comparative literature was first used in 1816, this is very interesting because this was used even before Goethe used the word world literature. 1816 and 1827, we have to mark. So even though the term comparative literature was first used in 1816 in the title of a book in the French language called Cours de littérature comparée. No, this is the title by Jean-François Michel Noël. But its use in the modern sense took place in 1886 when a British professor, Hutchison Macaulay Posnet, that is the that name of the professor, published a book with the simple title Comparative Literature, which established the term throughout the English-speaking world and later spread to every part of the world. So from that England to Japan to America to now that every part of the world, including India and maybe that other part of Africa. With the coming of the comparative literature, the idea of literature took a new turn. Accordingly, the focus of the world literatures also changed significantly. As A.O.N. Eldridge, in his essay, The Universal in Literature, points out, and I quote Eldridge, in ordinary usage, the term comparative literature refers to relations between two or more national literatures, but it may also be used to indicate the relations between literature and other humanistic areas of study, such as art, music, cinema, the social structure, or science. Briefly defined, comparative literature can be considered the study of any literary phenomenon from the perspective of more than one national literature or in conjunction with another intellectual discipline or even several, unquote. So this is where, that Aldrich talk about how, that one national literature can be compared with another national literature or more than, that one. While comparative literature has opened up several areas to understand and appreciate the ways human expression can be studied in multiplicities. I use the word multiplicities without referring to maybe, that it is not just, that the literature, but also language, caste, race, religion, that gender and whatnot, that. So I use the word multiplicities, hoping that, that people will understand. So it has its limitation as well. though it has opened up several, that areas of understanding, but it has its own limitation. As Aldrich observes, and I quote Aldrich once again, to go from literature as such to comparative literature is a progress from unity to plurality. Please try to understand this, that because when we are talking about one literary discourse, it is one unit. So that's why the idea of unity. So now we are diverting our attention to the idea of plurality. It is obvious that comparison requires two or more elements to be analyzed jointly. At the same time, it is a reductive process, going from literature in the mass to constituent elements of two separate national literatures. Even if we consider the concept of literature in the broadest sense as comprising all works of verbal expression in existence, this mass of material must be broken down into parts or units in order for comparison to take place. Paradoxically, in this process of considering units or individual works rather than entire literature, the comparist tends to reveal the totality or universality of literature. To adopt an English aesthetic maxim from the 18th century, the comparatist doesn't seek to demonstrate variety in the midst of uniformity, but instead the reverse, to demonstrate uniformity or aesthetic unity in the midst of variety. So this is where that the idea of reductionism is coming. So there are two ways that one can understand about comparative literature. One is definitely trying to that make our understanding of literature in a vast span of maybe that several centuries, that when we compare, say, sometimes that comparison could be between Kalidas as early that maybe 4th century BC of an Indian playwright to Shakespeare who belongs to that 16th 17th century, that. So it could be as vast as possible, but what Eldridge talks about is by bringing the dimension of unit and parts while comparing, sometimes that we miss the entirety of the literary, that maybe that creation. So from uniformity to variety, of course, that he emphasizes often. So the second, that aspect of world literature is to bring the idea of comparative literature so that there is a way of understanding different milieus in which literature is being produced, whether it is cultural, linguistic, or that other that areas in which, meaning apart from thematic, that it is not just that when we talk about comparative literature, it is not just about the topical similarity, but also trying to understand about the way culture inhabits in a particular national literature. Also the idea of that religious that gender, ethnicity, and whatnot. So I'm just leaving the second part of my lecture by just hinting at that how comparative literature can aid to another dimension of understanding of world literature. The third component is language and translation. I'll just deal a little, not much actually. So language is an important component of literature, and translation plays a vital role to make the text available for the readers who may or may not be able to read the original language text. In that sense, translation is a discovery. In fact, translation as a discovery is the title of the book, that by Sujit Mukherjee. I'm sure that people have read. Also, that his second book is Translation and Recovery, because we'll talk little about recovery. Translation, therefore, is indispensable for the promotion and propagation of the world literature. So without translation, perhaps world literature is not, that possible to be propagated, read, or maybe that. So translation plays a very important role so far as world literature is concerned. But as we all know, translation at times is distrusted. So there is distrust because that good translation, bad translation. Also, that whether the translators does justice to the original text, because in the process, many of the cultural idioms and expressions are lost. So we are not going to deal with many issues relating to translation. I'm just leaving some of the words, hoping that that people will understand. So, translation at times is distrusted and even despised. That because uh, hope we in India know that translators are not being that properly paid, not respected. Meaning now perhaps that with Booker Prize, that coming to a translated text, perhaps the world has recognized the idea of translation, but then so far as the translated texts are concerned, they are not being equally uh, paid respect as compared to the original writing. Uh, so translator becomes, that the second fiddle. But we also know that if there are distortion in translation, it can readily be corrected, perfected, brought up to date by successive generations. As Albert Guerard, that I quote Albert Guerard, who emphasizes in the context of world literature, saying, and I quote one line from his essay, every age has and should have its new translation of Homer and Dante. And I say, why not? Because we all know that in India also one text sometimes has multiple translations. No, look at say Rasa Sundari Devi, the first Indian woman to write her autobiography, Amar Jivan. There are at least that two translations. Ghare Baire, Home and the World by Rabindranath Tagore has, that three different translations. So, that we know that it is possible that every generation reads if they find the translation imperfect or incomplete, they can always have their own translation and should be, that perfected if there are lacuna. Once the literary texts are available, now I'm coming towards the end of my lecture, whereby whether once texts are available, either through translation, what could be the pedagogical approaches? So this is the last, the thing that I need to talk about as a student of literature. Once the literary texts are available in original language or in translation, the next thing to ponder is which are the texts which can be offered when we think about a paper on world literature? Because Hindi University, as Professor Nandini pointed out, that you are trying to build up resources uh, for offering a new course maybe or making a new syllabus. So that's where that the idea of pedagogical approaches will come. So I want to that bring uh, two that one or two things while talking about the pedagogical approaches. So now that the texts are available, which are the texts we can offer as a part of world literature, if at all there is a title of a paper called world literature. That I'm just trying to emphasize that in a post-colonized, post-globalized, post-human, post-truth, and you can go on and on using the word post. Sometimes, the people are also using uh, past, post, that etc. etc. So in a post-colonized, post-globalized, post-human, post-truth world, several literary voices, including marginalized voices, can jostle together. This is what that I'm talking about. So when we talk about world literature, we did talk about the idea of European literature first, but Europe is not the world, and that's why now we are trying to expand the horizon of that world literature by putting into several constituency, including the marginalized voices. So I'm just giving that some names, and these are not just that limited. So along with Pablo Neruda, say Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Octavio Paz, Derek Walcott, Chinua Achebe, Gugi Wathingo, and our own meaning, that we are talking about Indian Dalit writers like Om Prakash Valmiki, Bama, Saran Kumba Limbali, and many others can be a choice to put together. Here, I'm not going to enter into the debate about, that because we are trying to put together a paper called World Literature. So maybe, that if questions arise, then maybe I'll be able to answer specific question. Otherwise, just I leave it to you. So these are some of the writers we can always think about offering a paper. The kind of thrust the poets and writers give, because there is multiplicity, as I said, that each of them, say when you talk about Chinua Achebe and Gugi Wathingo, there could be a debate because we know about Gugi was the author of Decolonizing Mind, and he always emphasized about writing in um, mother tongue, Yuku. Whereas Chinua Achebe always, that thinks about writing in English so that English could be a vehicle to write the empire back. No, so there could be several debates. I'm not bringing all those debates. And within, say, post-colonial, even Dalit writers, there could be differences. Say, Bama is a very different writer who writes in Telugu. She writes about, say, Dalit Christian. So it is not just Dalit as a homogeneous entity, but there could be many more, the diversities and pluralities that is coming from even Dalit writers in India. So lots of that debates and discussion can take place, whom to include, and maybe that out of infinite maybe number of poets and writers. And that's why what I say here is the kind of thrust the poets and writers give to the ordinary and common in their everyday life deserve to be heard not locally but globally as well. Because earlier we talked about European writings, talking to maybe the few people, but now that ordinary and maybe that everyday lived experiences are being told even by the domestic help, like Baby Haldar, the life less ordinary, no, and even a prostitute writing autobiography, or even that a hijra writing autobiography. So there are lots and lots of voices coming to tell us about that how different marginalized subjectivities are important to not only hear but also to that perhaps examine, and that is the only way to perhaps that bring different voices together to set a paper called World Literature, where we can that try to understand the local issues globally, and that's why also the translation. So as Bilasini Kupan writes, and I quote her, the globalization of literary studies doesn't involve simply leaving the nation for that other social, political, and imaginative space shaped by the dual forces of human migration and electronic media communication, which Arjun Appadurai evocatedly adopts the transnation. Rather, the globalization of literary studies entails the learning and teaching of a kind of relational thinking in which we see the nation through the local yet as part of the global. So how the local can be connected to the global because we are living in a globalized world. So let's come to the conclusion then. Yeah, my conclusion is thus, the comparative world literature has lots in its basket to offer to us as consumers. I conclude my lecture with a quote from Dionys Darchin, who writes, and I quote him, "It is becoming apparent that the concept of world literature need not be abstract, but can be quite concrete." Because I have already referred to lived life experience, compelling us to formulate new literary historical, but mainly theoretical categories. Thus, for many of them have only been dealt with empirically. One reason for this is the fact that world literature was understood as a fictive and inaccessible category, yet we know that it is both a basic and a main target literary concept. Literature, literary events, and the literary process cannot be fully understood without the criteria which are implied within them. Hence, world literature is indispensable, goes to a reader, helping him to find his bearings in national and foreign literary trends. Consequently, the term has formative significance. Unquote. Thank you all for your present listening. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Rajkumar. Can you hear me?
I can hear. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So, needless to say that your lecture was very, very engaging. I was keenly listening to every word that you uttered, and I have also jotted down a few things for our syllabus design, where we will definitely need your help.
Yeah.
And I would like to inform the participants here, including Professor Nishi, that I had delivered a lecture on his text Veda, the translated text Veda. I knew the author Akhil Naik personally and Professor Rajkumar as well, both of them. So I have seen how seriously he takes translation and the pedagogy of translation. And today's lecture, he addressed about the historical emergence of world literature. So probably when we design a syllabus, we will start with that. The first block or something can be about the historical emergence of world literature. And also a very important thing that you touched, which very few people would actually talk about, is translation and the role it plays in comparative literature, world literature, and its pedagogical challenges. You talked about that. And the German connections of translation studies and world literature also. And then you talked about the connections between texts through translation that create relationships between nations. And post-colonial literature, globalization, I'm sure that the students have taken the notes about the things that you told. And then something that you said is interesting and important. World literature is definitely beyond Europe. Usually people think when it is world literature, it's European literature. It's definitely beyond Europe. This is for the students. And then from unity to plurality, the idea of the comparative literature and understanding the cultural milieu of a place again is important. I would like to inform that many of our students are placed as translators in many places. Students pass out from our university and they're immediately hired as translators in many professional institutions and universities. And we are going to have a training and placement cell in the university as well, where we will give a lot of importance to the translators being placed in very important and very respectable positions. I will take special care of that. And your lecture was very important for the Department of Translation Studies. So many teachers from the Translation Studies department are listening to you. I'm sure that they have a lot of questions at the end of the lecture after Professor Nishi has spoken. And well, the texts to consider when we design the syllabus, it is very important. It's going to need a lot of brainstorming for each one of us. That is where we will invite you people. And world literature is a concrete idea. It's not an abstract and empirical idea. Yes, I'm very happy to hear that. And also, you talk to our students about post, and past, post. Those are new things. They must have been smiling and they must have been thinking what is post, and what is past, post. We will talk more about those. And I would just stop here by saying that we are a very flexible language university. Though our name is Hindi University, definitely we give a lot of importance to Hindi language, but we are a flexible language university. We are planning to introduce 22 MA programs in 22 Indian languages, and also folk languages and tribal languages and language depth, those kind of programs and courses we're planning to introduce. So the politics of language is not going to be a big trouble for us because we are a flexible language university. And with this, I will stop and then we'll go to Professor Nishi. After that, we will take questions for both of you. Thank you once again for this wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor.
Paramita?
Thank you, ma'am. And thank you so much, sir. Now, I would like to say that it is an honor to introduce the eminent writer, Dr. Nishi Pulugurtha, ma'am, who is an associate professor in Department of English in Brahmananda Keshav Chandra College in Kolkata, West Bengal. She has taught at several postgraduate departments as well. Her areas of interest are British Romantic literature, Indian writings in English, the diaspora, disability studies, and Shakespeare adaptations in film. Dr. Pulugurtha ma'am has published in referred international and national journals like in the Coleridge Bulletin, the Encyclopedia of Postcolonial Studies, Shakespeare and Indian Cinemas, Local Habitations, edited by Poonam Trivedi and Paramita Chakravarti. The Cambridge Companion to British Romanticism and Religion has been edited by Geoffrey W. Babu, among others. Along with this, she has a monograph on Durosio and has edited a special issue of Cafe de Senses on epidemics, pandemics, and literature, and a special feature issue of Muse India on Shakespeare in Indian cinema. She has also edited the volume of essays called Literary Representation of Pandemics, Epidemics, and Pestilence. She is an author, poet, editor, critic, and translator too. And her publications include travel writing like Out in the Open and Across and Beyond, in poetry like The Real and the Unreal and other poems, Raindrops on the Periwinkle, Looking Poems, Voices and Vision, in short stories like The Windowsill and Frame, and in essays like Lockdown Times. Um, she's, I mean, it is exceptional, like the writer, the way she has given us so different kinds of literatures, I mean, the different things that we get to know from her. And one more thing I want to add here, that her co-edited translation work, Bandage Moments, is a forthcoming literary work from Nyogi Books. Along with this, she writes on Alzheimer's disease, and she is a member of the Advisory Board of Alzheimer's and Related Disorders Society of India. She is also the Secretary of Intercultural Poetry and Performance Library in Kolkata, West Bengal. So now I would like to request Dr. Nishi Pulugurtha ma'am to enlighten us with her lecture.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Paramita. I would like to thank Professor Nandini Sahu for this invitation and for making me a part in some way of Hindi University. It has been a pleasure knowing you for so many years, and an even more pleasure to interact with you, in the physical space of the state that you are in as of now. I would also like to, it's been wonderful to listen to Professor Rajkumar speak, because you actually laid the groundwork. The background is done for whatever one needs to know, in a nutshell, what one needs to know about what comparative world literature is about. And I'm so happy you brought in translation. Of course, you yourself are a practicing translator, so it's obvious that, and we cannot think of, as you very rightly said, we cannot think of world literature without translation. I'm also very happy to, interact with members of the Hindi University, both the faculty and the staff and the students. So it's been a pleasure and a privilege for me to be on this platform with all of you. As I said, Professor Rajkumar has laid the background, and I will possibly be continuing from what he has said. Of course, I will be focusing on one text, and then ultimately I will speak initially about world literatures and then go on to speak about one particular text. I'm also so happy that he spoke so much about Dalit writing, because the text that I'm going to talk about is a work written by a Dalit author and is also a translated text. So, we are kind of, though we have not interacted at all, this is the first time that I'm meeting Professor Kumar, but we kind of seem to be tuned one to another. And I'll end with speaking about my own experiences in the classroom, though I'm actually teaching. I belong to the Faculty of English Literature, but then right now the very discipline of English literature has changed so very much. We are not just doing English literature, but we're actually doing literatures in English. We are doing literatures in translation. Very much in translation, because we have a paper on partition literature, and there we do texts from Urdu, we do texts, Hindi text and Bangla text in English translation. So this is something that we are doing as of now. So so I feel that reading comparative literature helps helps widen our knowledge of different cultures. And when I say comparative literature, I'm so glad that Professor Kumar spoke of the fact that we are not just thinking of literatures written outside India, but we're also very much thinking about literatures written within India. And I think reading comparative literature helps us to widen our knowledge of different cultures, customs, history, the tradition. It also enables us to view different writings from very different angles, because we are also getting conversant with different critical ideas, with different theories. So comparative world literature is an interdisciplinary approach, and Professor Rajkumar has spoken about this. It's an interdisciplinary approach to literature that combines the study of literature with other disciplines. And this is something which is very important. We just not just doing literature, but we are also bringing in several other disciplines. The very word world in world literature is at the forefront of literary study, as it brings in global perspectives. This is something that emphasizes the study of literature as a way of crossing linguistic, national, and cultural boundaries. As I was working on, what to talk at this webinar, I was reminded of Rabindranath Tagore's essay, Vishwa Sahitya, World Literature, delivered in 1907, where Tagore explores the idea that world literature is a reflection of the unity of human experience and creativity. For him, he believed very strongly that world literature is a creative process that connects people across the world through a very common human struggle for aesthetic expression. Rabindranath interprets world literature as a humanist project generated at a moment when aesthetics transgress nationality, and when humans create a bond with difference. The aesthetic bonding in which the self opens to the other and vice versa engenders the possibility of crossing the borders of space, time, nation, and culture, each of which are very, very important. I'll just quote from what Rabindranath writes. The word Sahitya, literature, comes from Sahit, meaning together. Hence, if we take into account its etymological sense, we find in the word Sahitya the idea of a union. It is not simply a union of idea and one idea and another idea, or union of language and language, book and book. Nothing except Sahitya or literature can establish deeply intimate ties between one person and another, between past and present, between far and near. The people of a country deficient in literature have no vital bonds to join them. They remain isolated, unquote. This is from Tagore's lecture. Encountering the world in Tagore's sense via literature is about the way we experience the ongoing creative potential of each individual as an intercultural effort on the writer's part, in the first instance, to remake the self and the other, the indigenous and the foreign, in an open-ended, superfluous, even gratuitously wasteful spirit of what he calls Ananda. Professor Rajkumar also spoke of the idea of translation, and which is a process that talks about the crossing of boundaries with an awareness of difference. And hence, it's also something that is needed to be understood and be aware of when we are taking into account cross-cultural relationships and problem areas. When we are doing translation studies and cultural studies, there's a lot of similarity. There's a lot of coming together of both of these areas when we are talking about translation. And when we are talking about world literature, comparative world literature, of course, translation is a very, very important area. So it is important to understand translation as a cultural technique capable of managing tensions arising from the shifts and differences seen in the source text and a meticulousness that discerns the interaction process. So there is a need then to talk of new qualities of translation, of cultural techniques for dealing with complex situations in which meanings, translations, and perceptions not only travel, but are also shifted and most importantly transformed. And as I said, the importance of culture in translation cannot be overemphasized. It's something very, very important. Tradition, geographic origin, all of these impact the context of language. And when practicing translation, it is vital to be sensitive to the moral and spiritual values of words to find the most accurate equivalence in the new language. I would here in my paper like to focus on one particular text, which of course was something that I began working on when I was working on the Sahitya Academy event, which Professor Sahu spoke about. And I was looking at that point of time about myths in that work. And this is a work, it's called a Dalit epic written in Telugu by a poet called Gurram Joshua, who writes this work called Gabbilam. And incidentally, there has been a new translation. Professor Kumar spoke about how there are multiple translations of the same work. And Gabbilam, this is not the first time it has been translated, but the work that I have in hand, the work that I have been reading, is a very interesting translation, a very good translation of Gabbilam, which was published in 2022. And as he was saying that you could have various translations, as a politics of translations as well. I was thinking about the several translations of this particular text that have existed. And the one that I have right now is the 2022 one, which has been translated from the Telugu by Chennaya Jangam. And Jangam actually won an award for this wonderful translation of this work that he does. And Joshua's work is very interesting because Joshua is someone who belonged to a community where people were not allowed to read Sanskrit, which he wanted to read. He wanted to learn because he was interested in the literature. He wanted to be aware of the classical epics. And it was very difficult for him to learn all of this because of his caste. So we have caste politics coming here. But in spite of this, he does manage to read the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And this reading of his, results in his expulsion from the Christian community to which his family had converted. And he also loses his job because of this. He wanted to collaborate with the Brahmin Pandits to learn Sanskrit, but because of his caste, he was not allowed to do that. However, it's very interesting that he learned Sanskrit as an act of revenge against all the humiliations that he faced. And his revolt was to challenge the status quo. Where it was thought that poetry could only be written by an upper caste person, and only that poetry could be valued. What Joshua does is that he writes this epic called Gabbilam in a Telugu, which is very Sanskritized, the Telugu that was predominantly used by the upper caste people. And in doing so, what he was doing was he was trying to assert his identity, and he was claiming a place for himself in the literary canon as well. The context of this work, Gabbilam, as an epic text is very unique because it managed to shake the foundations of classical Telugu literary sphere, because this is the first Dalit text which not only met but also exceeded the upper caste expectations of language. Joshua writes this text in a very classical manner to suit the complicated grammatical rules of the Sanskritized Telugu language, and he's doing this both in thematic creation and content. The genius of Joshua was that he subverted these Brahmanical themes and contents by making the central figure of this epic, Gabilam, a Dalit. The central figure, the Dalit character, is not a minor figure. He's the protagonist and rebel who refuses to accept his condition, who questions. It is also interesting to note that Gabilam makes claims for Dalits on history and the emerging nation as equal partners and imaginaries who have built the civilization for centuries. As I said, Joshua is challenging the dominant Sanskrit and Telugu literary sphere by choosing the bat, known as Gabbilam in Telugu. The bat, the animal, it's neither a bird nor an animal kind of thing, and it is generally believed in the Telugu circles that in Telugu culture, that the bat is a bad omen, right? It is usually found in dark, damp places, hanging upside down. And he chooses the bat, he makes the bat, in Telugu it's called Gabbilam, the bat which is considered neither a bird nor an animal. And he uses this particular creature to speak about the existential status of the Dalits. He subverts the classical poem by Kalidasa, Meghaduta, and instead of using swans, parrots, peacocks, or clouds as messengers, he uses the very stigmatized bat, the bat which is looked down upon as a bad omen, the bat which hangs upside down in temple towers to send his message of suffering to the god Shiva. This work was published in 1941, and as I said, this is a path-breaking work of literature, Telugu literature. And in the preface, Joshua notes, and I'm quoting, I wrote this text by keeping Kalidasa's Meghaduta, the cloud messenger, in mind and chose Gabbilam, or the bat, as the title. For some readers, it might sound harsh. The protagonist in Meghaduta sends a message of love. My protagonist sends a searing, poignant message. The protagonist in Meghaduta was sentenced to 1 year, but my hero was sentenced from birth, for generations without any end. The hero in the Meghaduta was a Hindu Cupid suffering from a burning desire to meet his lover. My hero is a victim of poverty that burns his stomach. That is why he says, even to hear my tearful story, one needs a soft heart. So this is very interesting what Joshua says out here, because what he's doing out here is he's trying to construct an alternative discourse similar to the one found in classical texts like Meghaduta. As I said, Gabbilam presents a Dalit man as the hero and protagonist, perhaps for the first time in the classical verse epic tradition of Indian poetry. So he's using the classical verse epic tradition, but he's subverting it. And this is one of the first earliest texts to speak about oppression, exclusion, dehumanization of the Dalits in a very caste society. In Telugu literature, this particular text occupies a very important position, not just because of the way in which the hero was being presented or the protagonist was being presented, not just because you have a Dalit protagonist, but also because for the first time you have a poet using the language of ordinary people, bringing the language of ordinary people into the classical medium. Joshua's work, as I said, subverted the themes of classical Telugu literature, which was predominantly centered on imaginary romance or on the retelling of the Puranas and the epics, by bringing in the lived experience of the Dalits in his writing. The poem Gabbilam begins in Tanjore, modern Tanjavur, a city known for its literature and wealth, the once capital of the mighty Cholas, whose power and glory spread far and wide. And the protagonist belongs to this city. He's not given a name. And his identity is set out right at the very beginning. And I'll just quote a few lines from the poem. He stitched shoes to protect the feet of great upper caste heroes of the nation and led life as a dutiful man. The protagonist is all alone with no company, toiling hard to earn his livelihood. His is a life of suffering, one in which his touch is considered polluting. This is a line from the text. As he says, and I quote, born a slave and an outcast, how can he think of wife and children? So he doesn't get married, not wanting to bring them into the world of despair. He lived his life celibate. And in these lines, Joshua's anger, suppressed anger and frustration at the condition of the Dalits in the social order that he is part of is clearly presented. So the protagonist of the poem is all alone after a day's hard work when a bat enters into his hut. He's all alone. The only other creature, living being with him is the bat. Shunned by the world, he finds in the bat an auditor who will listen to his tale. So he begins to tell his story to this bat. Right. And this entire scenario speaks about social isolation and the pathetic human response and the state. And he speaks of the bat, "O queen of bats, welcome to my house." I'm quoting from the poem. "You live in the most auspicious temples. You perform prayer standing upside down. You are visiting an untouchable who has no respect in society. It is a good omen for your children." He has one question for the bat, a question for which he seeks an answer. And his question is, why is he an outsider? Why is he an outcast, shunned by all? And the only person who can answer his question is the Lord Shiva, who is seated in Kailash. So he decides to make the bat his messenger. The bat is going to take this question that he has all the way to Mount Kailash. And the poem speaks about this journey, the long journey that this bat undertakes from Tanjore right up to Mount Kailash, where the question would be posed to the god. So what Joshua in the poem is doing is critiquing Hindu social and religious practices, and he's writing about the injustice and the exploitation. It's very interesting that he uses the literary language and combines that with the everyday language spoken by people, what is called Gramya language. This language was held to be offensive, but Joshua's use of them subverted the standard upper class use of language. His work became so popular that lines from the poem were sung in villages and they became people's songs. In his choice of the title, Joshua draws a similarity between the life of an untouchable and that of the bat. Just as the bat symbolizes a bad omen and is treated neither as a bird nor an animal in the Telugu cultural scenario, similarly, the Dalit man, the Dalit person, is not treated as a human being despite being a human, and is denied basic human rights and dignities. And he writes, and I quote, "Unlike the noble kings, exquisite birds like swans and parrots cannot become his messenger. That is why I chose a regular visitor to the home of the despised, a bat, as his messenger." I hope readers will agree and understand the aptness of the title. In his presentation in the whole poem, he laments the different dimensions of caste oppression and the miserable condition of the Dalits. Most importantly, he voices his protest against Hindu religious and social practices, ridiculing them, contesting these ideas. And the text in several places is very, very poignant, while he's also referring to contemporary political movements such as the anti-colonial nationalism of Gandhi or Ambedkar's role in the emancipation. All of this is part of his poem. You can understand it's written in the 1940s, a time of great ferment. Joshua, as a poet and intellectual, was unique. And as Jangam, who translates Gabilam in 2022, notes, that especially in the context of the anti-colonial nationalism and the growing political assertion among Dalits, however, Joshua maintained a cautious distance from active politics, but his writings makes it very clear that he was aware of the political and social reality of the time that he was writing. He did not join any political organization, or he was not very openly, he did not align himself with any nationalist cause. But he spoke about them in his writings clearly, right? And what is the reason why I suppose Gabbilam is so very important in Telugu literature and also possibly in in Indian literature is because he's using his own experiences of life as a Dalit, someone who had to face discrimination and humiliation, that it becomes the poet of this iconic poem that he wrote. So he was ostracized by his fellow Christians because he was reading Sanskrit texts and epics, because he wanted to know these knowledge. And all of these, all of his experiences as a Christian, his reading of Sanskrit text, all of these find their way into his work. They shape his writings and make him hope for a world that would overcome all. And he himself writes in a place that when he was writing, there are two gurus in his life, he notes. First was poverty, and the second was caste and religious discrimination. I'm quoting from what he wrote. The former taught me patience in life, and the latter made me revolt, but they did not enslave me. However, while facing both, I tried to prove myself as a human being. I revolted with my knife. My knife is a pen. It did not hate society, but its practices. It's important to remember that he's not the first person who wrote about caste discrimination or untouchability in Telugu. We had Veera Brahmam, who was a social reformer, Yogi Vemana, both of whom questioned caste and social evils. Both of them traveled all over and spoke of social reform and untouchability. Most of their work was lost, but later on in the 19th century, they were collated by C.P. Brown, who later edited the works of Vemana. And it is in their works that one notices that the Dalit becomes the subject for the first time, right? And I also want to refer to how later anthologies, for instance, in there was an interesting anthology which came up, I forget the name, sometime in the middle of the 20th century, a Telugu anthology of works, but Joshua's work is left out from that. So it's also important to see how he's invisibilized, how his erasure happens. But in spite of it all, the literary importance of the text and the text as a social and cultural document remains. This is not the only work that he wrote. He wrote several other works. He wrote Firdausi, he wrote Kandasi Dudu, and each of these stand as powerful testaments to his commitment to social justice. Joshua even received the Sahitya Academy Award for his work titled Christu Charitra in 1964. So there was recognition which came in later on, and in spite of the fact that there had been attempts to erase his work from anthologies, you do realize that good iconic literature will always stand the test of time. So at a time when romanticism, patriotism were ruling the roost in Telugu literature, Gurram Joshua stood out very, very differently. He even took potshots at his contemporaries for not being able to write about the poor while they're talking about the beauty of nature. Right, and as Jangam, the translator, writes in his introduction to his translation of Gabbilam, the making of Gurram Joshua as a poet and anti-caste visionary is part of an oral and cultural tradition that challenged caste inequality and oppressive Brahmanical practices for centuries. As I was saying right at the beginning, when I teach from my own experience in class, I have found that when it's very convenient for me when I'm teaching American literature, for instance, and I'm teaching Toni Morrison, for instance, when I'm talking about race, when I'm talking about oppression, when I'm talking about discrimination, it's very convenient for my students to understand this whole idea of race and discrimination when I speak to them of the Dalit experience. Right. This because I feel that this is something that is much closer to what they are at home, something that they would understand in many ways. And so I am using, several of us are actually using several ideas of comparative world literature when we are teaching in our own ways. And as I said, we are speaking about literatures in English these days. It is no longer just British literature that we are talking about. So when I'm teaching race in American literature, I speak of the Dalit experience. I ask them to read certain texts or some stories or maybe a small little poem that would enable, or maybe we pick up a newspaper item which talks about discrimination that has happened somewhere, because there's still so much a part of the world that we are living. And it becomes very easy for my students then to understand race in the American context and the Dalit experience in the Indian context. So I feel that, working towards a comparative world literature, talking more and more, bringing in these various texts from various languages, and I'm sure Professor Rajkumar was talking about Burma as well when he was talking about world literature, and he did mention that each of them speak about their experience, discuss their experience in various ways, various different ways, because each one comes from a different kind of a background. But it's very interesting to see how each of them could be placed side by side in order to have a much wider, much expansive idea of literature, which is not going to be just restricted to the text that one is talking about, not going to be restricted just to look at metaphors and ideas of expression and what the poet is talking about, but also looking at the larger historical context, at the larger social and cultural context. And for all of these to actually happen, we of course need translation. So we have actually in practice very often moved towards this transnational literature that Professor Rajkumar spoke about. And I think with the passage of time, we are going to move further and further. So this very idea of having a department to do with comparative world literature, I think is a wonderful idea of making literature, reaching out and bringing these various literatures into one kind of one syllabus, into a structured syllabus, talking about the whole idea of comparative world literature in a much more structured, regimented, if I could use that word, structured is a better word, structured way, so that our students grow up, begin to read these various kinds of literatures and see these linkages between these various writings. So when you are not just restricted to one kind of writing, but reach beyond. So when you are talking about, when people are reading, my students are talking about romantic literature, I make it a point to talk about what's happening in India at that point of time in the 19th century. Because I think these linkages are what is very important, where we are talking about, we have to look beyond boundaries, beyond nation, beyond languages, and try to find these linkages between all these kind of languages. And I think when and if we begin to do that completely, we come closer to what Rabindranath Tagore was talking about, how world literature would become a humanist project, where we are looking beyond borders, where we're looking beyond borders of space, time, nation, languages. And of course, when we talk about languages, we are, of course, we have in mind translation, and that's something very, very important, that brings all of us into this one, we get to know more and more. And I think for us in India, each of us are actually working with translation at almost each and every stage. We move between languages, even without realizing that we are doing it, but we are very often moving between languages. And several of us are comfortable with more than one language, our mother tongue and Hindi and English. These are usual languages that we are very comfortable within. And I think we have a lot of, we could come together and work at creating this wonderful repertory, where repertoire of literatures and our Indian literatures in the various Indian languages, it's so rich. There's so much that Indian literature has to offer. As Professor Rajkumar began by saying, that the moment we think of comparative world literature, we are mostly thinking about Western texts, which we have read as part of our syllabus when we were students. But it's important to expand that to include other literatures as well, in order to create this wonderful repertoire where we are looking beyond just one language, just one culture. As it is in India, we cannot think of one language and culture. We have several, but we include all of this to formulate a new way of looking at literature, a new way of approaching literature, which is interdisciplinary, which talks about history, sociology, cultural studies, all of these together. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nishi. Am I audible? Okay, okay. It was really reassuring and convincing to listen to you that the ideas that we have conceived to introduce a new department of comparative world literatures. It's something that is the need of the hour. When you talked about history, sociology, and cultural studies and literature departments, all of them coming together and creating a very interdisciplinary department on comparative world literature. So it was rather reassuring to listen to you. And I'm happy to play the role of the bridge between Delhi and Kolkata here without having any discussion among the three of us, like you, me, and Professor Rajkumar. We have not discussed anything, but somehow the lectures delivered by both of you were definitely in tandem with each other. It was as if it was designed this way. He theorized something like Dalit literature and translation studies and cultural studies, and then you took it further in a very, very flexible manner. And yes, you talked about the flexibility of English departments. We are very interdisciplinary now. English departments have taken all the literary theories that social sciences have been using. With the introduction of cultural studies, English departments have become very flexible. We are talking about green cultural studies, about ocean humanities, about blue humanities, about medical humanities and digital humanities, translation studies, hospitality studies, hospitality. In fact, a lot of things are in sound culture studies. Look at the kind of things we are doing in the English departments now, in the literature departments, I would say. So you somehow touched upon all those things, and yes, you told about the crossing linguistic and cultural boundaries, and then creating a new discipline. Yes, and Tagore's Vishwa Sahitya, that book I was reading. Very recently, I was reading that book, Tagore's Vishwa Sahitya, where he talks about translation as a cultural technique. You have definitely taken a lot of interest in that text, and you hinted at that. And the role of culture and geographic origins in cultural studies is something that you emphasized. And the moral and the spiritual value of words, something that I really liked. So when we design a syllabus, I'm sorry. So when we design the new syllabus, we will talk about the moral and the spiritual value of words, and the Dalit text that you emphasized by Joshua. It was very interesting. I haven't read the book. I'm definitely going to read it. And then you made some comparisons between Gandhi and Ambedkar's roles in the world literary scenario, and yes, then Dalit experience in Indian context, then world literature beyond borders, very pertinent ideas were there in your lecture, and I'm sure that we're going to talk more about it in our next lecture with you. Now, while I thank you very much for bringing in this fresh and very new ideas to our discourses, I leave it to the participants here to ask you a few questions to both of you, you and Professor Rajkumar, if they have any, and then we will slowly conclude. Yes, Paromita?
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, now I would request the participants that if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
मैम
Yes.
मेरा एक सवाल है, क्या मैं पूछ सकती हूँ?
Yeah, sure. Please.
थैंक यू मैम। नमस्ते, मैं डॉक्टर गुड्डी कुमारी, शिक्षिका हिंदी विश्वविद्यालय, हिंदी और ट्रांसलेशन। सर, मेरा एक सवाल है कि डिजिटल युग में तुलनात्मक साहित्य के अध्ययन में क्या परिवर्तन आए हैं, और क्या डिजिटल युग में मानव अनुवादकों की आवश्यकता कम पड़ रही है? जो एप्स है, जो साइट है, कहीं ना कहीं बड़े बड़े अनुवादक और लेखकों की किताबें मैंने देखा है कि उनका जो मतलब वो ऐप से ही ट्रांसलेट कर लेते हैं या कुछ, तो क्या वो रचना जो है उसकी मूल मूल रचना जो है, क्या वो उसी तरह पेश मतलब नहीं हो पा रही है? जो जैसे मैं बांग्ला में पढ़ती हूँ तो मुझे कुछ अलग लगता है, और मैं वही अगर हिंदी में पढ़ती हूँ तो मुझे परिवर्तन होता है। जैसे देवदास हुआ और साहे बीबी गुलाम, ये सब जो रचनाएं जो बांग्ला में है, वो पढ़ते हुए मतलब लगता है कि अब रो देंगे, या बहुत भावुक हो जाती हूँ। लेकिन हिंदी में कहीं वो कमी हो जाती है, तो क्या ये नुकसानदेह है? क्या करना चाहिए इसके लिए?
Professor Rajkumar may like to answer.
Yeah. Yeah, so Dr. Guti, you know that you are very right, meaning we already talk about, मैं थोड़ा हिंदी में बोल नहीं पाऊंगा गुटी, yeah?
सर कोई कोई दिक्कत
अंग्रेजी
नहीं,
में बोल
इट्स ओके
सकता
सर।
हूँ ना, थोड़ा सिंपल इंग्लिश
ओके
में।
ओके सर, ओके सर।
या सो आप जो डिजिटल ह्यूमैनिटी बारे में पूछ रहे हैं, यू नो द डिजिटल ह्यूमैनिटी जो शुरू हुआ है, दिस इज डेफिनेटली ए न्यू प्लेटफॉर्म जो बोल रहे हैं, ठीक है। न्यू प्लेटफॉर्म है जिससे आपको किताब लिख के पब्लिश करना जरूरी नहीं है, आप ऑनलाइन में किताब बना सकते हैं, कुछ कमेंट कर सकते हैं, ट्रांसलेशन कर सकते हैं। बट जो आप अब जो बता रहे हैं डिजिटल ह्यूमैनिटीज का जो ट्रांसलेशन है, जो आप बेसिकली यू आर आस्किंग अबाउट ट्रांसलेशन। तो ट्रांसलेशन वी हैव ऑलरेडी टॉक अबाउट, ट्रांसलेशन इज बोथ ए लॉस एंड ए रिकवरी बोलते हैं। लॉस इसीलिए होता है कि कल्चरल जो इडियम्स एंड एक्सप्रेशन कुछ होता है, ट्रांसलेटर्स जानबूझ के नहीं छोड़ते हैं, समटाइम इट बिकम्स डिफिकल्ट टू गेट ट्रांसलेटेड। मैं उड़िया हूँ, भेदा जब ट्रांसलेट कर रहा था, बहुत सारा उड़िया वर्ड कुड नॉट बी ट्रांसलेटेड, तो हमने क्या किया है, रिटेन किया है ओरिजिनल वर्ड को, और एक ग्लॉसरी दिया है फॉर नॉन ओडिया रीडर्स, सो दैट दे अंडरस्टैंड अबाउट द मीनिंग ऑफ इट। तो एक तो ओडिया होने के नाते सारा ओडिया को अंग्रेजी में ट्रांसलेट, क्योंकि मेरा दो उड़िया भी जानता हूँ, अंग्रेजी भी जानता हूँ, हिंदी थोड़ा कम जानता हूँ, उसका मतलब नहीं है कि एवरी ओडिया विल बी ट्रांसलेटेड इनटू इंग्लिश कंफर्टेबली, और कुछ वर्ड है डिफिकल्ट टू गेट ट्रांसलेटेड। तो मैं आपको एक दो बात बता के छोड़ता हूँ। देख लीजिए, आप आपने सुना होगा एक पता नहीं, मैं हर टाइम एग्जाम्पल देता हूँ, जैसे झूठन। झूठन आपने अगर पढ़ा होगा हिंदी में, झूठन ओम प्रकाश वाल्मीकि का, ही
प्रकाश
जे,
वाल्मीकि।
हाँ, ओम प्रकाश वाल्मीकि का ऑटोबायोग्राफी का नाम है झूठन।
यस यस।
देख लीजिए, झूठन का ओरिजिनल टाइटल झूठन है, बट अंग्रेजी की टाइटल भी झूठन है, क्योंकि झूठन को अगर आप अंग्रेजी में बोलेंगे लेफ्ट ओवर फूड, तो उसका जो कल्चरल एक एक्सप्रेशन होता है, झूठन इज ए कल्चरल इडियम जो है, जो इंडियन कल्चर में जुड़ा हुआ है कास्ट के रिलेट, मीनिंग कास्ट के साथ। तो अगर आपको मीनिंग अंग्रेजी में ट्रांसलेट करना है झूठन को लेफ्ट आउट फूड, उसका एक्सप्रेशन अच्छा नहीं आएगा, इसीलिए ओरिजिनल टाइटल को रिटेन किया गया है। बट देन देर आर ऑल्सो यू नो दैट एक्सप्लेनेशन अबाउट, तो आप अगर पढ़ेंगे झूठन को झूठन बोल के, देन यू अंडरस्टैंड अबाउट व्हाट द कल्चरल प्रैक्टिसेस अबाउट ए भंगी कम्युनिटी और चमार कम्युनिटी इन उत्तर प्रदेश। लेकिन क्या हुआ है, कुछ ट्रांसलेशन ऐसा हुआ है, मैं जस्ट आपको एक दो एग्जाम्पल देके खत्म कर लूंगा। एक पंजाबी दलित राइटर है बलबीर माधोपुरी, उस उनका ऑटोबायोग्राफी का नाम है छांगिया रोग। पंजाबी पता है आपको? पंजाबी किसी को अगर पता होगा, छांगिया रूप का मीनिंग है, हम क्या करते हैं, जो घर में पेड़ रखते हैं, बानियन ट्री, पता है? बर बर बोलते हैं, हम बर बोलते हैं उड़िया में।
वट वृक्ष। यस।
बट वृक्ष को आप अगर घर में एक पॉटेड प्लांट में रखेंगे, छोटा सा पॉट में रखेंगे, तो बढ़ता जाएगा, तो आप क्या करते हैं, हर टाइम
बोनसाई बना
उसको
दो।
बोनसाई बना देते हैं, काटते रहते हैं।
यस सर।
तो
यस सर।
चांगिया रूप का मीनिंग है, दलित आर ट्रीटेड एज bonsai tree because they are never allowed to grow। उनको ऊपर जाने के लिए नहीं देते हैं, जैसा मैडम निशी मैडम ने बताई गविलम बारे में, कास्ट डिस्क्रिमिनेशन है। तो चांगिया रूप का मीनिंग अलग है, बट उनका जो अंग्रेजी ट्रांसलेशन हुआ है, आप अगर ट्रांसलेटेड टेक्स्ट पढ़ेंगे, अगेंस्ट द नाइट, तृप्ता जैन ने ट्रांसलेट किए हैं, उसका टाइटल रखा गया है अगेंस्ट द नाइट। उसका मतलब कुछ नहीं है, अगेंस्ट द नाइट का मतलब आप समझ भी नहीं पाएंगे। तो ऐसा ट्रांसलेशन में क्या होता है, अगर डिजिटल ह्यूमैनिटी का बारे में आपने पूछ रहे हैं, सेम प्रॉब्लम यू विल एनकाउंटर। तो मेरा जो लेक्चर में भी मैं बताया कि एक तो लॉस भी हो सकता है जो कल्चरल इडियम एंड एक्सप्रेशन के साथ, बट देयर विल बी आल्सो गेन, क्योंकि आपको, अगर मुझे हिंदी पता नहीं है और पंजाबी नहीं है, तमिल नहीं है, तेलुगु नहीं है और बंगाली नहीं है, मैं क्या करूंगा, ट्रांसलेटेड टेक्स्ट माध्यम में आई विल एबल टू रीड। तो ये गेन है, इसीलिए मैं बोला ट्रांसलेशन इज ऑल्सो ए डिस्कवरी। एंड तो प्रॉब्लम तो है, ट्रांसलेशन हैज इट्स ओन प्रॉब्लम, बट जो डिजिटल प्लेटफॉर्म है इट मे बी एन इनेबलिंग प्लेटफॉर्म, क्योंकि डिजिटल ह्यूमैनिटीज अगर नहीं होता तो हमको एक जो मौका मिला है पढ़ने के लिए, जानने के लिए, सीखने के लिए, ये नहीं मिलता। दिस वेयर दैट वी हैव टू मे बी दैट मेक यूज ऑफ इट रेशनली थोड़ा। ठीक है डॉक्टर गुडी?
जी सर, बिल्कुल।
ओके, थैंक यू, थैंक यू।
Yes,
Thank you for that. I mean, that's a very interesting thing that you said.
right.
Because when we are translating, we are translating for someone who doesn't know the source language. So as he said, there is lots lost in translation, but I think the gains in translation are much, much more. और जितना भी आप कोई ऐप यूज करके ट्रांसलेट कीजिए, यू कैन नॉट डू विदाउट द ह्यूमन थिंग,
Oh,
एज
yeah.
वेरी राइटली सेड। आपको कुछ कुछ तो आपको रिटेन करना ही पड़ेगा। वो आप खुद करके देखिए ना, हम लोग बहुत टाइम मीनिंग्स भी फाइंड आउट, राइट, इसका क्या हुआ। सो व्हेन यू ट्राई टू डू इट, यू सी इट्स नॉट द राइट वन,
Right,
right?
right.
So it's an enabling, yes, but usse it will never replace, I suppose, the human, at least not now. It's not going to
Yes.
replace the human mind.
Yes, of course. So both very, very enriching lectures. A lot of ideas came to our minds, and we are going to take this further. I think it's time that we should conclude this session. We will have many more sessions with both of you. Thanks a lot, Professor Rajkumar and Professor Nishi, for being with us. Namaskar.
Namaskar.
It
Thank
was
you so
pleasure,
much.
pleasure and
Thank-
privilege. Yeah.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Once again, Honorable Vice Chancellor Ma'am, Professor Nandini Sahu Ma'am, Professor Rajkumar Sir, Dr. Nishi Pulugurtha Ma'am, and all the participants for joining us today. Thanks.